Oh, Chelsea, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. You're talking for 10 minutes.
We should look up the line I newspaper this week.
With companies, usually all the
I feel
time.
like some perspective and sometimes Seattle. Where that. So I don't know what.
Come down here.
I have to leave early.
Oh, okay. Okay, fine.
I have a signing sheet right here.
You got
Do
the
want
sign
just to
sheet?
pass it around right now?
Yes. Is Julie going to get some more drink or something?
I don't know. I just got here from class.
Wait a couple of minutes. Wait till 10 past. Around this side. Well, I think we'll begin. Thank you all for coming. Nice to see you all. I'm Helen Haste. I'm one of the leaders of the Civic Law Education Initiative. We're very glad to see you all. We will be passing around a sign-up sheet, partly because if you're new, we'd love to have your email addresses so we can add you to the mailing list. It's just nice to have this come and for our records, the numbers and things, so if you don't mind making sure you sign up when we pass it around. The second CMI event this semester will be, the one after this one will be in 2 weeks' time, roughly 2 weeks' time, on the 23rd, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, but you'll get notification of that in due course. So I'm delighted today to welcome a visitor from Israel, Lotem Perry-Hazan, who's just here for a very short time, and she's been meeting lots of people, hopefully interested, certainly very interested in her work and connecting with lots of people here. So we hope that sometime in the future we'll be able to come back for a longer period. Lotem is currently assistant professor at the University of Haifa in the School of Education, where she's in fact the head of educational management program. Her background is very much in law. She was trained in law, and she, the first half of her career, she clerked in the Israeli Supreme Court with the former Chief Justice Dorit Benish. So she has a very impressive lived experience. She then did a master's degree in law at NYU and returned to Israel to Haifa for her doctorate, and that's where she's now been for a while. Her research currently and in the past is broadly on the intersection of law, education, policy, and religion, and she's in the process of moving into a new project specifically on participation in human rights. So we're delighted to welcome Lotem to the graduate school education and to the CMEI series. After Lotem has spoken, will be a commentary from Jacob Fay, or Jake Fay as we know him, who is a D4 in, I think it's English, isn't it? also one of the early career scholars in the Spencer program on New Civics, and is a former member of the Harvard Ed Group, so we have a very erudite contribution. Lotem, it's wonderful to welcome you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hayes. Do you hear me?
Right, yeah. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can
Yeah,
hear you anyway,
okay.
because it's just recording. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Hayes, for inviting me and for Julia, where is Julia, for organizing this event.
Actually, I'm
And
not sure it's just switched on. Is it switched on?
well, yeah, it's supposed to be switched on now.
Right, carry on. Okay.
Hopefully, it will be
Yes.
okay. I have a lot of equipment here. Well, my paper is examining the interrelationship of free speech in school and participation. Well, I'm exploring the differences between these two theoretical frameworks, which are also normative frameworks. I'm exploring how they apply in different situations. And hopefully, I will assist in shaping more just and educative policy for coping with children's controversial expressions in schools. Well, Amanda created a petition stating, "We, third grade kids, don't want to go to the circus because they hurt animals. We want a better field trip." This is a case from 2003. Derek drew gang signs on his school papers. Jacob refused to play a basketball game to demonstrate the team's sincerity concerning claims against an abusive coach. And Ryan called the assistant principal a dick. Well, the freedom of speech doctrine in the American Constitution perceives all of this as speeches. The limitations of these speeches were determined by 4 landmark cases of the US Supreme Court. I'm sure at least some of you know them. The first is Tinker from 1969. In this case, the court overturned the suspension of middle school students who wore black armbands to school. They wanted to protest the Vietnam War. And this is what the court said. School children's free speech can be restricted if the speech invades the rights of others or creates material and substantial disruption to the work and discipline of the school. And this is a second case. Fraser, 1986, a high school student delivered a vulgar speech in the school assembly. He wanted to nominate his friend to the student council. We will read this speech later. Well, the court ruled that school officials may determine that vulgar speech is undermining the school's basic educational mission. A similar ruling is in Hazelwood, 1988. In this case, the school principal eliminated 2 articles from a school-sponsored newspaper. One of the articles dealt with pregnancy experiences of 3 students, and the other dealt with the impact of divorce on the student author, and she identified in her full name and also made some critical comments about her father. So the principal eliminated the articles and the students sued. The court ruled that educators can exercise editorial control so long as their actions are reasonably related to legitimate pedagogical concerns. And the last case, the most recent case, is Morse, 2007. This is Joseph Frederick. Joseph Frederick came late to school. He joined his classmates to watch the Olympic torch. It was a school-supervised event. And then he folded this banner, "Bang Hits for Jesus." He prepared it at home and just folded it in front of the TV cameras. He wanted to get the camera's attention. The principal, Deborah Morse, she approached him. She told him to remove the banner. He refused, and then she suspended him from school. The court ruled that educators may limit speech that can reasonably be regarded as encouraging illegal drug use. Well, if we sum up the 4 cases, this is the normative picture. Restrictions on school children's free speech. First, speech can be restricted if it invades the rights of others, that's tinker. If it creates material and substantial disruption to the work and discipline of the school, this is also tinker. Or if it contradicts educational rationales. This is Fraser, Hazelwood, and Morse. I suggest in my paper that these restrictions are actually similar to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this is Article 13 of the Convention. The child shall have the right to freedom of expression. The exercise of this right may be subject to certain restrictions, but this shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary for respect of the rights or reputations of others, this is tinker, more broad, or for the protection of public order, this is Tinker's substantial disruption test, or the protection of public morals. And this is similar to the educational rationales of Fraser, Hazelwood, and Morse. Well, in my paper, I examine the differences between free speech and the right to participation. More specifically, I look at the contours of children's right to participation, which I will read in a minute, in order to suggest differences between speeches that we should protect and speeches that we shouldn't protect. And this is Article 12. Before I read it, I want to say that Article 12 is the core of the innovative approach of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And this is a very important provision that was incorporated in the legislation of many countries, included Israel, and actually, except the US, Somalia, and South Sudan, all the countries in the world signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. State parties shall assure to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting the child. The views of the child being given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. This is the evolving capacities principle, okay? So we have like two elements, the right to express views and the right that these views will be given due weight according to the evolving capacities of the child. So we are finishing the legal part of the presentation, don't worry. So the interrelationship that I check in my paper are relevant, I think, both to the US. The US didn't sign the convention, but I think that the right to participation may assist in setting the limits of the educational rationales here of the First Amendment. And of course, countries that signed the convention are obligated to both provisions. Well, the first question that I ask is, what are the differences? So we look in the literature about the right to participation. Laura Landy, a prominent scholar from the UK, she offers a model that conceptualizes the right to participation by 4 elements. The first is space. Children must be given the opportunity to express a view. The second is voice. The views of the children must be facilitated. The third is audience. The views of the children must be listened to. And the fourth is influence. It means that the views of the children must be acted upon, right? Of course, as appropriate, according to the evolving capacities principle. Well, Landy mentions briefly in her paper that free speech is intertwined with voice. I think that not all speeches correspond with the right to participation. Actually, I think that this right captures only voices that strive for influence. I think that this is a dialogic right. It doesn't capture, for example, curses or threats, and I will explain it later. So this is the first difference. The right to participation captures only voices that strive for influence. And I want to emphasize, this is not a content-based test. I look for the goal. Participatory expressions, they can be unpleasant and rebellious. They sometimes can hurt those whose behavior is being criticized, right? But they are aimed towards changing policies and practices. They are aimed towards creating a dialogue, and therefore I offer that they should be allowed more protection. Well, the second difference relates to the fact that the right to participation was conceptualized as a gradual shift of power. There are many models that conceptualize different practices that reflect the right to participation, but the most influential one is that of Roger Hart. Well, Hart drew a ladder of participation, and these are the three first stages, which are actually non-participation, manipulation, decoration, and tokenism, if you can't read in the back. And then there are practices in which children are assigned but informed, consulted and informed, and then adult-initiated practices in which decisions are shared with children, child-initiated and directed practices, and at the top, child-initiated practices in which decisions are shared with adults. Well, this model conceptualized the right to participation as a gradual shift of power, and it was developed by other scholars. And these are a few examples, but there are more. Well, so this is the second difference between speech and participation. Well, participation in some way forces adults to listen to children. Free speech doesn't force adults to listen to children. It forces them not to prohibit the speech, but it doesn't force them to mobilize a dialogue. The third difference concerns the different channels of mobilization. Well, free speech doesn't require specific media for mobilization. But the right to participation requires some dialogic organizational spaces in which children can transform their ideas into policies and practices. Well, some of these spaces can be more structured, like student councils. Others can be more open, but they should provide the opportunity to initiate a dialogue. Well, another issue that I deal with in my paper is the justifications for free speech and participation. Well, in this presentation, I don't have enough time to elaborate. I just want to stress my argument that all of these justifications, which derive from various studies about children's rights, students' voice, sociology of childhood, civic education, of course, all of these justifications, I think, are stronger when the expressions are participatory. I think that participatory expressions that create a dialogue and strive for influence have more potential to educate in and for democracy, to equalize educational opportunities. Levinson's book is relevant in this regard, to develop better educational practices, to improve school climate, and of course to fulfill human rights, because the right to participation is like a key right that facilitates the fulfillment of other rights. And now I get to my main question, which is, how do children's right to participation and free speech correspond in different situations? in order to answer this question, I use a database of American cases that deal with free speech in school. Well, I searched the LexisNexis database, and I looked for cases that cited the 4 landmark cases of the US Supreme Court. The search results were a little less than 300 cases, and I chose 60 cases. How did I choose these cases? These were the criteria. First, cases that didn't raise questions that are unique to the American constitutional framework regarding the role of religion in public schools. As I said, I think that my paper is international in its scope, so I don't look to analyze a specific issue of religion in the US context. Cases that concerned a specific expression and not a school policy. Cases that discussed the speech rather than the forum. I looked for speeches, not for cases that say not in the cafeteria, but yes, in the yard, okay? And cases that discussed on-campus expressions. I didn't look for online expressions, for example, or off-campus expressions, because they raise additional questions and the normative framework is somewhat different. So 60 cases is a lot. So I don't pretend like to offer a comprehensive analysis of each and every ruling. Of course, there are a lot of facts that deserve attention. It's more like an overview of the interrelationship between free speech and participation that can serve as a roadmap for future analysis of specific cases. So we'll start with expressions that the courts permitted. The courts ruled in favor of the students, okay? So these are a few examples. There is here an example of a T-shirt that said that George Bush is a chicken hawk president. In the back, it said like that he was a former alcohol and drug user. Here is a button stating no school uniforms, and this is a picture of the Hitler Youth. And cancer awareness bracelets that included the words boobies and breasts. And actually, almost all the cases that were in this category of permitted expressions were very similar to Tinker. Remember Tinker, the black armbands? So in most of these cases, students wore like controversial T-shirts, buttons, bracelets, armbands, and the court approved these speeches according to Tinker. This is another example of pro-life literature that was distributed within the school. And I also looked for you in the news to find more contextualized picture of these cases. Yes?
Just a quick clarification question. The 60 cases, are they mixed in terms of district court, state, and different things?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. They're really mixed, yeah. And they also include the 4 Supreme Court cases, okay? So actually there are 56 plus 4. Yes?
Okay, for any of these cases, are you looking at the final case in that series? Like, would you look at, for example, the BH case at the Third Circuit and then again at the Supreme Court?
Well, I look just at the final decision, okay? And before, I wrote the final version, I looked back to search, if a higher court decided a different decision, okay? So I cite the final decision in each and every case. Okay, so actually these expressions, most of them were participatory. However, they didn't go much beyond changing students' opinions. Like, they didn't strive for a lot of influence. And this is exactly why the court approved them, right? There wasn't any substantial disruption to the work of the school. As I will explain in several minutes, when the students did strive for stronger influence, the courts didn't approve the expressions. Well, in most cases, the courts ruled in favor of school officials. I categorized these cases, and the first category accounts to the question of age. Well, Here are two illustrative examples. One, which I really love this example, is the third grade petition that objected the planned trip to the circus. I have a third grader at home, so maybe that's why I really love this case. And another example is a T-shirt reading "Unfair Grades, Racism, and I Hate Lost Creek." So in both cases, the courts disapproved the expression just because the children were young. Like, there wasn't any discussion regarding the age of the children and their maturity. And see, for example, what the court said in the Walker-Cerrone case, the petition. Implicit in the petitioning activity is that the young listener is capable of comprehending the advocated position. It is unlikely that the third grade children here could have had knowledge of how a circus treats its animals. Well, maybe the petition could have encouraged, like, the children to ask more questions. Actually, in this specific case, the curriculum of the third grade included a lesson in which the children were asked to circulate a petition about a matter of community concerns. So there should be like some kind of balance between the damage that maybe can happen if they will sign a petition that they don't fully understand, and the benefit that they can learn about participation, right? And there wasn't any discussion in the ruling regarding these questions. And I think that in the end of the way, the overt and hidden curriculum of the third grade might clash. Well, in this category, I suggest, of course, I don't criticize the specific results. I just want to suggest that in each and every case, there should be a substantial discussion regarding the age and maturity of the children, even if the children are very young. Another category, threatening expressions. Consistently, courts didn't approve any threatening expressions, expressions that threaten students, parents, teachers, and I want to emphasize several examples. Well, one example is a poem that describes the student author shooting other students. Another example is drawing gang signs, and shooting during a cops and robbers play at a kindergarten, I'm going to shoot you. Shouting, sorry, not shooting, shouting, I'm going to shoot you, okay? So this kindergarten student was suspended because he shouted, I'm going to shoot you. So I don't want to reflect on the specific results of these cases, just to say that threatening these expressions, whether they are more severe or less severe, they don't collide with the right to participation. Actually, threatening expressions might silence participatory expressions because they might create, in certain cases, intimidating educational climate. Another category, expressions advocating illegal behavior. And I chose here a few examples, again, illustrative examples. One example is a T-shirt advocating violence. Another example is unofficial newspaper, which included an article that advocated vandalism. And the third example is a school band song advocating drug use. Remember the Morse case, okay? So, you know, it goes here in expressions that advocated drug use. Well, I suggest that in these cases, if we search for the dialogue, right? The right to participation means dialogue. So we should start by surveying the political discourse regarding the issue. Of course, there is no legitimate political discourse that is advocating violence or vandalism. But there is a political discourse, a legitimate political discourse about the legality of drugs. However, these are not like unequivocal answers. The analysis should be, of course, a case-by-case analysis. And the Morse case, remember, so it's not about participation, right? Joseph Frederick claimed that the banner was just nonsense. He just wanted to get the attention of the cameras. And this is what the concurring opinions said. Do you know what's a concurring opinion? It's like when they agree to the final result, but they want to suggest another justification for the result. So the concurring opinions stated that the ruling provides no support for any restriction of speech that can plausibly be interpreted as commenting on any political or social issue, including speech on issues such as the wisdom of the war on drugs. So this statement is about participation. And I think that it may assist in setting the limits of expressions that advocate illegal behavior.
Can I just ask you a question about
Yeah.
your previous slide, just a clarification
Yeah.
of what you said? About the, could you just go one slide back?
One back. Just a moment.
Yes.
Here, yeah.
So, if I understood you, you thought that the song advocating drug use could be considered a genuine political issue.
Well, this is an example. Actually, I don't reflect on this specific case because it might be the same circumstances as Morse. Well, we should look for the true intent to create a dialogue and participate in a certain discourse. Like,
But you said the first one, violence, would never be considered that. But in the United States, there is a political discourse about, you know, regulating guns and stuff. So no bag limit superimposed over an automatic handgun is a political position in the United States. So, I mean, one we might not like, but so I was just wondering about how you would think about participation in the context of...
Well, actually, I think that in this specific example, maybe I was too much focused on the decision of the court that saw this as a really true threat and limited it, but generally you are totally right. If there is a legitimate discourse that children want to reflect about the wisdom of using drugs, of using guns or not using guns, so it's the same thing like in here. We should survey the political discourse and see if the children wanted to participate in it or just wanted like to advocate something
So you
that
were
is not
saying
acceptable.
this should be contextualized to purpose. So if it's really to participate in a political discourse, then it would be tolerated, and if it wasn't,
Yeah,
it wouldn't be.
yeah. So maybe if I want to continue your comment, so it's two tests. Like we check if the children wanted to participate in the discourse, and we also should check if there is a legitimate political discourse, okay? Because in this case, for example, there couldn't be any legitimate political discourse, like to advocate vandalism against the homes of teachers. But you're totally right about the guns. Vulgar expressions. This is a very interesting category. Well, consistently, courts didn't approve any vulgar expression following Fraser, the boy that delivered a vulgar speech in the school assembly. And they chose the Fraser speech as an illustrative example because I think that it is a powerful speech. And I will let you 2 minutes to read it. Better that you'll read it than I will read it with my English. Right, this is a participatory expression, right? And this is a very powerful expression. Well, vulgar expression, they can attract much more attention. They can sharpen the messages. And they can even engage students who usually don't engage in participatory frameworks. There are a lot of research about who is joining school councils, for example. Well, I think that the limits of vulgar speeches should start with a dialogue, and I want to cite the dissenting opinion in Fraser. I remind you that in Fraser, the majority opinion was for the school officials that suspended Fraser. And this is what the dissenting judge said. Matthew Fraser was probably in a better position to determine whether an audience composed of 600 of his contemporaries would be offended by the use of a four-letter word or a sexual metaphor than is a group of judges who are at least 2 generations and 3,000 miles away from the scene of the crime. Well, this is a very, very powerful assertion, right? And I think that, of course, sexual metaphors, they may not just be bad tastes. Like they may also make students uncomfortable, especially in a school assembly, right? And in certain cases lead to sexual harassment. So limiting such expressions should start by a dialogue. Not a dialogue in the court, of course, when the judge hears evidence. A dialogue within the school that share power of decision-making between teachers and students. And such a dialogue may assist in bridging the generation gap that Justice Stevens is talking about. Offensive expressions. Well, a lot of offensive expressions. Bullying, harassment, many racial statements and symbols, and of course, offensive expressions which their main goal is to offend, they are not participatory expressions. But more complicated cases involved expressions that were participatory but also offensive, okay? So let's read an example. Wildman case. This is a letter that a student distributed in the locker room. Take 2 minutes to read it. Okay, so this is a strong letter, right? She called for she strives for influence, but the problem is that she used the word bullshit. So the court struggled to find the line between the insubordinate speech and the offensive part of the speech. And this is what the court stated. I think that it represents the ruling. Rebecca Wildman's letter, containing the word bullshit in relation to other language edits and motivated by her disappointment at not playing on the varsity team, constitutes insubordinate speech toward her coaches. Well, the court, as I said earlier, struggled to find the line between the insubordinate part of the expression and the offensive part of the expression. And I think that an analysis that takes into account the right to participation should draw this line. And this line should also shape the educational reactions. In this case, while Rebecca Wildman was forced to apologize for writing the letter, she refused, moved to another school, and sued for damages. If she was forced to apologize only for the word bullshit rather than for writing the whole letter, maybe it could be a better educational solution and also prevent the entire controversy, which lasted several years in courts. The last category, dissenting expressions. And here I mean expressions which the main goal was to dissent. There weren't prominent offensive parts. Well, this is a petition wrote by high school students. They were members of the football team. I hate Coach Everard, and I don't want to play for him. Pretty bad wording, right? Well, this was the petition, but these were the arguments, and I cite from the court's decision. The coach struck a player in the helmet, threw away college recruiting letters to disfavored players, humiliated and degraded players, and used an inappropriate language. Well, the court checked these arguments and said that they were justified. The students were right. However, this was the ruling. Public schools are necessarily not run as a democracy. Schools exist to provide a forum whereby those with wisdom and experience, the teachers, impart knowledge to those who lack wisdom and experience, the students. A ruling from 2007. The court. Oh, I don't remember the judge. Well, you can look in my paper, you can find all the full references. The disrespectful and insubordinate actions of the students were compared by the court to a player giving lip to a coach during practice or a student making a smart remark to a teacher. Well, if we look at the right to participation, so we can draw a clear line between the petition and a player giving lip to a coach during practice or a student making a smart remark to a teacher, right? So I think that in cases of dissenting expressions, there should be such line. Courts and, of course, teachers should consider the importance of dissent and, of course, the proper ways to teach children about the role of protests and strikes in democracy. The problem with the current case law is that dissent inherently disturbs the work of the school. So I think that there should be some balance between the substantial disruption test on one hand and the educational rationales on the other hand, because participation is part of these educational rationales. Well, this was a really brief discussion of the categories, and I'll move to my concluding remarks. Just a moment. Okay. So, the first thing that I want to summarize concerns, of course, the importance of identifying participatory expressions. While free speech doctrine binds all expressions together, the right to participation, I think, unties the binds and assists us in capturing expressions that deserve more protection because they are invaluable for democracy and they help to integrate the overt and hidden civic education curriculum of the school. The second comment that I want to emphasize concerns the need to shape participatory disciplinary policies. Most of these cases shouldn't have go to the courts. I think that participatory disciplinary policies, for example, restorative practices, if you know, this is a really prominent policy in Australia, also in the UK. These policies not only fulfill the right to participation, but they may also prevent all the conflicts that the zero tolerance policies induce. And I think that the numerous American cases that I checked in my research, they exemplify the high educational prices of legal battles over school discipline. And the last comment, that I think that it is the most important comment, is about the most important agents of children's participation, who are not the judges, but the teachers. Well, if teachers want to understand the importance of participation, and they won't believe in its benefits, so they won't be able to mobilize it, to share their power, and to shape participatory spaces. Well, the right to participation assists teachers, I think, in drawing a line between expressions that mock and degrade them and expressions that may eventually contribute to a more collaborative educational climate. And in order to draw this line and to protect even dissenting expressions, teachers need more human rights education and, of course, continuous professional support. And teachers also need to be more empowered in the broader institutional environment because disempowered teachers cannot empower the students. And the last thing that I want to emphasize is that bottom-up policies that focus on teachers as agents of participation are much more just, educational, and I think also more useful than a top-down policies that focus on protecting participation in courts. So, thank you all for listening, and again, thank to Professor Haste and to Julia and to all the colleagues who provided very helpful comments to my paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks. So I'm going to sit down and read because that's sort of what my discipline does. So I've prepared some comments that I'm just going to read to you all. So anyway, Professor Perry-Hazan began her talk by identifying 4 different examples of student expression that are all treated under the aegis of freedom of expression. She offers a complementary or perhaps alternative account for evaluating these cases and others like them based on a principle of freedom of participation. Perry-Hazan first details the distinction between freedom of participation and freedom of expression and offers some reasonable rationales for why both should be respected in educational spaces. She then turns to criticism of current legal thinking about student freedom of expression, as articulated by the Supreme Court through 4 central cases, Tinker, Fraser, Hazelwood, and Morse, and subsequently applied in numerous others. As I read it, the crux of the problem for Perry-Hazan is that legal standards based solely on freedom of expression may actually conflict with and limit students' participatory freedom. This is an interesting proposition, for while some of the most celebrated free speech cases, namely Tinker, are inextricably linked to participation, others like Morse are much less so. The question then is, what do we gain by moving to a participatory freedom standard? I think Perry-Hazan helpfully integrates a more explicit conversation about the freedom of participation into discussions typically limited to student expression. I particularly appreciated the way in which she conceptualized freedom of expression as incommensurate with freedom of participation. That is to say, while freedom of expression simply requires students have voice, participatory freedom entails that individuals have voice as well as space, audience, and influence. Thus, it seems right to think that considering participatory freedom must extend beyond simply what students say, but the context in which they say it. Do schools create dialogic spaces for students to participate in conversations about controversial issues? Do schools provide authentic audiences for students to speak to? That is, not simply listeners, but those who might act on what is said as well. And we should think that this must include adults as well as fellow students. Do schools allow students to have some influence on those matters that affect them, appropriate to their age? These seem necessary components of a rich and robust sense of participatory freedom. And I should say that some of my comments actually stem from the paper, which I had the pleasure of reading, so I will be drawing a little bit from that. However, I'm worried at times that Perry-Hazan reduces this rich sense of what it means to protect students' participatory freedom to a much more simplistic argument. Indeed, when she notes that children's participatory expressions in the paper deserve special protection because they aim to change policies and practices, she confuses me. I do not see how the aim to change a policy or practice merits special protection. In fact, I'm not sure that participation can be reduced to advocating for change. My point is that changing policy or practice is not what is at stake when we think about participation. It is recognition of one's status as a decision-making member of society. In these particular cases, then, participatory freedom reflects students' standing as valuable members of their school. Considering not only whether an expression is permissible, but also whether and how schools create space for students to use their voice in a meaningful way, and thus respect students' standing as members of society is what is at stake. If we extend this analysis, I think it changes the conclusions we should reach about some of the cases of which Perry-Hazan is critical. Consider the Pinard and Lowry decisions. So the Pinard was the basketball case where the boy decided to boycott playing in a game, and the Lowry is the petition against an abusive coach. Perry-Hazan argues that these cases should be treated differently than at least the Wildman, which she put up, which is the sort of insubordinate speech that used the word bullshit, as all that was at stake was the degree of disruption. This conclusion, I think, is too hasty. If we think about what participatory freedom entails, there is more we need to know about each case. Focusing on a participatory framework would require knowing what options students had to express their dissatisfaction with the coach before submitting the petition. In each case, were there different routes students could have taken to deal with their abusive coaches? If so, and the students ignored these options, then we may be less inclined to support their petitions, though we may be sympathetic to their pleas. In a democracy, striking or seeking to oust a leader are measures not to be taken lightly, and usually occur under conditions where there are either no outlets for civic voice, or alternatively, voices exist but all other options have been exhausted and injustice remains. If the schools, as perhaps Lowry and to a much lesser extent Pinard suggest, did nothing in response to student complaints through established channels, or failed to even offer a space for students to exercise proper influence over a matter extremely important to them, their safety and dignity as individuals and athletes, then perhaps the petitions were justified. But if students opted to take the most disruptive route before exploring other options, then the consequences for their actions may be more justifiable than Perry-Hazan seems willing to grant, as the school has not violated those students' standings as members of the community. Thus, though the analysis may be in some sense different if we put participatory concerns front and center, we still are in essence dealing with the issue of disruption, but perhaps from multiple viewpoints. Thus, the conclusion might not be. The general point of my comment is the following. There seems to be compelling reasons to explicitly engage with the notion of participatory freedom regarding student expressions. But this move does not solve the issues that I think are at the heart of these cases. The fact that we are dealing with children, and these cases are in schools. Certainly, it seems a much more interesting question to ask how children should be regarded as members of society than whether what they say is permissible or not. Student expression is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to broader issues about how to acknowledge student standing in society. Beneath voice, so to speak, are a mess of considerations about space, audience, and influence. Yet determining what degree of voice, space, audience, and influence appropriately recognizes student status as developing citizens is a difficult and messy puzzle. Surely, because we recognize that children, especially younger children, are particularly vulnerable members of society, it does not make sense to regard their participatory freedom as identical to adults. But recognizing their status as valued members of a school community means recognizing some degree of participatory freedom, and that degree should likely increase as they get older. Switching to a standard of participatory freedom does not avoid this puzzle, but it may help us think more clearly about it. Thus, though I am skeptical of her read of some of the cases, what I think Perry-Hazan has accomplished here is rightly broadening the range of considerations with which schools and courts should at least be concerned. Thank you.
Now, do you want to make any comments in response to Jake? We've been trying to give you, given he was quite critical. Why don't you make some comments in response?
I read it earlier, so I'm actually prepared. Just a moment, it's on. Okay. So first of all, I agree with what we said, and I think that most of the criticism that you raised is part of the legal focus of this paper that was written for Law Journal. And it includes 60 cases, and it didn't enable me to check the circumstances of each and every case. Therefore, I also mentioned in my paper that I don't pretend to criticize specific cases or to offer comprehensive analysis of the participation in, for example, Lowry and Pinard and other cases that I described. And all of the educational considerations that you talked about are, you can find them in current research about participation, and I'm also involved in empirical projects that include interviews, observations, focus groups with children that may assist in clarifying more educational issues that are related to participation. I explore participation in student councils, and these are the conformal students. I explore participation in suspension procedures. These are more the dissenters, and also participation in the community. And I think that I totally agree that in specific cases, the contextual analysis is extremely relevant, and it gives us the result that we should achieve. And this paper is talking more to courts than to teachers in certain ways, because they do have to find the right answer, should I prohibit the speech or should I not prohibit the speech? But it does give educators a toolkit things to think about, and you said it also. And for lawyers, it gives like a roadmap for analysis of future cases, and for educators, I said it to my students because I use these cases as a workshop in my children's rights class, that I don't say to them what they should decide, but I do give them a toolkit of consideration that they might or might not consider when they limit students' speech in school. Thank you.
Okay. Well, yes. We now have some discussion and comment from the floor. Speak quite loudly because we don't have to put the microphone around. We talk loudly enough we'll be able to hear what he's saying. Matthew.
Okay, so I have two questions. I'll try to keep them brief because there are two. The first one is about the limits of democracy within a school environment. So participation as the Convention for the Rights of the Child is how it understands it is very different from participation as under the U.S. legal context. So, like for example, participation in the education context really allows for students to be a part of decision-making processes about what they learn, how they're evaluated, a range of decisions from what do they wear, how they interact with each other, which, as a consequence, would privilege those kids with agency in the school environment. It is not a democratizing, it is not necessarily democratizing. If there are students who have, who don't have the same advantages, in fact, the convention itself speaks and says that it's important that the older and more advantaged foster the participation of the younger and most disadvantaged, which has a real noblesse oblige sound to it. So I'm struggling with how, in the American context, given huge stratifications, given within schools, given some of the issues that we deal with, how we can implement this. So let's put that to the side. And then the other one is about the role of parents as the ultimate deciders of their children's destiny, education, from Meyer versus Nebraska and Pierce versus Society of Sisters, which are the two cases that pretty much started our entire move toward public education. Yeah, pretty much that. Those were the two cases that did that.
Thanks, Matthew.
Well, I think that these two questions are intertwined. Both of them like about the analysis of American law and how the right to participation integrates in the analysis of American law. So in regard to the first question, well, there are several articles, and I will send you my paper, and you can find the references, Barbara Bennett Woodhouse, Emily Bass, and prominent US scholars who write about participation. And from their writing, I think that you can see the major linkages between the convention, Article 12 in the convention, and all the research in Europe about the legal right to participation and the concept of participation in American values. So that's for the first part of your question. And as for the second part, actually it's very interesting because the main reason that the US didn't sign the convention is parental rights. But this issue of school discipline, it's much less about parental rights than other issues in the convention. So that's why I think that it doesn't contradict American values and the American legal framework, because you can't find here like strong parental rights like you find in family issues, for example, that the family issues were the main reason that the US didn't sign the convention, and I also mention it in my article just to prove that it can be relevant to US law. Thank you.
Julie.
I also have two questions, although I'll just start with one and see if other people have questions. My first question is about the case you love so much, which I also love, the third grade petitioner about going to the circus. And that case the judge said they didn't have maturity, and your comment was, of course, maturity level and development needs to be taken into account. But you didn't explain how you would think that it would be taken into account, because the case you give us, on the face of it, since many mature people hold the position that circuses are immoral because of the way they treat animals, there's nothing necessarily immature in that position. So maybe it's that third graders couldn't wouldn't be perceived of as being able to come to that position themselves because it was too mature. So I'm like, how would you, it seems like a catch-22, like if they present a mature position, then it must not be their own because they're too young. And if they present what might be considered a developmentally appropriate position, then it could be dismissed because it's not mature. So how would you bring this into?
Well, this is like the $1 million question about participation. Like, how do we check evolving capacities? Like in Israel, the judge has to sit with the child and check it in each and every case, and to receive and to sit with the child, you know, in front of the child, not through like a social worker or psychologist. And there are many ways and tests that were developed over the years, like to check if children are mature. But in this context, I think that it's much more abstract. Like, and of course, it's also like, it shouldn't be checked in court. Like the teachers should check it in the classroom before it goes to the court. And in this specific case, the court did not conduct any discussion about the evolving capacities. The court just said they are too young. And what I argue is that there should be a more substantial discussion around this evolving capacities principle, because we can't just say the children are too young. The UN Convention actually, the general comments of the committee that applies the convention said that even like babies can participate in decision making. We should look at their, how they move in their environment and like non-verbal gestures, and we should pay attention to children in each and every age and to see how they can participate. And I totally agree with you that the question of parental influence is strong in the Walker-Serrano case and also in other cases. In Tinker also, they talked about the parental influence. And if a third grader would come to my school and I was a teacher, of course it's the first thing that I would check. If the parents wrote this letter or this petition and not a student by herself, if she understands it, if she really agrees with it, or if I'm protecting the voice of the parents, because if I protect the voice of the parents, so there's no like, it's not participation. It's what Hart called it, like manipulation, right? Yeah.
I feel like both sides of the argument, those who are in favor of democratizing school, bringing student voice in, and those who are on the other side, like we need discipline, they're both trying to use the court as this vehicle to drive social change. To me, it seems like what should be, just my personal opinion, is that we should move away from the court and more just focused on like the curriculum. I think it could possibly be better to focus this issue in more like local terms and leave it up to, you know, the communities, the parents to ultimately decide. Do you think that both sides of the argument would be better served just stop trying to use the court to drive the social change and focus more on curriculum?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I worked within the court, and I just published an article. It's going to be published actually in a few days about the limitation of courts in education policy. And I use the metaphor of third rail. When you go to the court, it's like a third rail. You explode in certain issues. And in Israel, there is no one case of children's free speech that reached the court because it's not part of the culture. And when I studied at NYU, I was amazed with this powerful like culture of litigation over free speech. It is amazing. And when I was a student, that's when I thought about the initial ideas that was the basis for this article. It took me a few years and also experience in teaching and mothering like to materialize these ideas. But I started from this notion that these issues shouldn't be in court. And I totally agree that we should think how not to get them to court. And actually think about the parents here. Like if your child would curse the principal, would you sue the principal for suspending him? Even if you think that the suspension like is not justified, would you go and pay the fee and go pay for a lawyer and sue the principal? Like, these decisions amazed me. Yeah.
Can I comment about it? I think because I come from a country which also isn't very litigious. It's fairly inconceivable to me that this would come to the courts in Britain, though we're going that way. But one of the good things about it going to court is it gets public debate.
Yeah.
That's the one benefit of the American system, is that issues that otherwise would be hidden in the community, the school, or the community generally, get into the court and get publicly. So there's a kind of democratic benefit of the very public discussion of these things. Though, I mean, it's a kind of swings and roundabouts. Jake, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's similar to what you were saying, actually, that I think it's not as clear cut as simply just allowing local institutions to make these decisions. I think that in some ways court decisions are reflective of sort of, they stand for something that's a little bit more collective in a way, and there are, sometimes there are. I mean, mostly, if you look at these all started out as disputes inside a school. They started out in a very local context, and that dispute could not be resolved in that local context because one party thought there was still injustice that remained. So they reach out to something that supposedly has authority to help deal with that problem, right? So I think simply saying these are not issues of the court is too much. Would it be helpful if we had tools to help schools make better decisions about these before it reached courts? Sure, but at the same time, I think having sort of collective standards to refer to, like being able to point to Tinker, are very important sort of standards to have in a democracy.
Well, I developed a model that checked the role of courts in education policy. That was the paper that I was talking about. It's another paper. So I use like 3 axes of legitimacy, competency, because courts usually don't know anything about education policy, and effectiveness. And the axe of effectiveness checks also the ability of the courts to do social change, which is a very limited ability, but also on the other side, the things that Professor Hayst was talking about, which is very important, the ability of the court to mobilize issues into the public debates, and also to raise rights consciousness, especially in disempowered groups. So this role of the courts are very important, even if the courts, they don't achieve the results that the petitioners looked for, like the hollow hope. Gerald Rosenberg, if you know Gerald Rosenberg, is a very important scholar in the US. So even if the courts are hollow hope in terms of, the specific result of the specific case, they do have much larger roles in the democratic sense.
Julie, ask the second question.
Okay, so my second question is about changing norms of participation and what's considered appropriate participation. And so we might think a school that really takes seriously part of its civic responsibilities, they would not want to just limit participation, but they would want to teach students proper, appropriate participation. And so in some of your examples, you could imagine that the school might have responded not by punishing the child for what they did, but by trying to educate them. So, for example, if you're going to have a petition that you would not use the word bullshit in it, or if you're going to have a petition about a coach, you wouldn't head it with "I hate that coach." So that it would be legitimate to be teaching them, okay, what are kind of you wouldn't have threats so what are the norms of participation could be something that would be legitimate for a school that took this responsibility seriously. But I am thinking about periods when norms of participation have shifted a lot. So I'm thinking about from the 1950s into the 1960s in the United States, lots of colleges said that they wanted to teach students to behave politically responsibly, and they would punish them for certain kinds of things, including when initially sort of sit-ins began and things like that. That was considered irresponsible behavior because it was illegal. But some of what students were trying to say is that we want to expand what's considered legitimate expression and a legitimate participation. And I think about the treatment of the flag in the United States is another example of that, where at one point in time, desecrating the flag was clearly, would have been, absolutely taught by schools as unacceptable. But in another period of time, it might be considered a very powerful piece of rhetoric. And so, how would a school that took the position that it had the responsibility of helping students learn how to participate responsibly. How should they cope if what's being challenged are the norms of participation itself?
Well, I think that this is a beautiful question that captures the main dilemma of children's rights, right? It's like the clash between children's interests, because we know better what is participation than the children, and the participation which is all about we should listen to children and we should maybe take into account what they do think that is participation, right? We want to protect children on one hand and to teach them our notion of participation, but maybe they have other notions. Well, I have a beautiful song in Hebrew that I usually play in the class. It's in Hebrew, so I tried like to translate a few words. Just a moment, I mean. About a father. This is my email. All of you are invited to send me an email and I will send you the paper. And this is the song. It's about a father who is singing to his son who's sleeping in the next room. And the next generation in Hebrew is Dor, is like a name of a boy. The next generation is sleeping in the next room. I hear him breathing. The next generation is dreaming in the next room and is murmuring his fears in his sleep. I want to go to him and hug him tight, but a second thought holds me back. I was wrong. He will be right. And I think that this part of the song, as well as other parts of this beautiful song, reflect this tension. And we should listen to children because maybe we are wrong and they are right. And in another part of the song, the father sings to him, "Don't be afraid, confront me. Don't give up your dream because my generation was wrong and maybe you will be better." So I think that it is a very, very sensitive dialogue which should be held inside the school. And I think that children's rights class, which will be obligated in each and every school of education, school that teaches teachers, not only like universities, and it can contribute like to better school policies. And part of the mission of the committee that applies the Convention on the Rights of the Child was to establish this duty to teach every teacher about children's rights.
Questions? One of the New Civics students wrote a piece, and I can't remember who it was now, who made an interesting point about dealing with encouraging participation in schools. That quite a lot of what young people, particularly quite very young people, get involved in is very trivial to us as adults, but important to them. And the point that this person was making, it might have been you, Jake, I can't remember, is that if we don't take seriously what actually we think is trivial, then young people will not feel confident that when they actually get to the point of having serious things to talk about, that they will have the interest or the concern or the power to do this. So if they're basically arguing about whether or not they're allowed to wear different coloured socks in school, which I can assure you was an issue when I was a kid, that's so trivial, but the kids who complain about the rule about socks may or may not end up complaining about the Vietnam War or whatever the contemporary issue is, if we take note of the complaints about socks. So I think, again, part of what you're saying also is the creating an environment in which we not only encourage participation as a principle, but actually recognize that participation can be unbelievably silly to us as adults, but we must not, it's a bit like the song really, we must not interfere with a child's definition of what's important, because that's part of the participation and the learning process and becoming efficacious as a citizen. So.
I think that, I don't know who of your parents, but I learn each and every day new things from my daughters. And one of them is 4 and one of them is 8. And both my young daughter and my older daughter, they teach me every day new things. And I really try to hear them. and of course also to take their opinions into account and to do this balance. I always think about this balance because it's really an educational balance, like between the children's voices and choices, in my opinion. And I want to also to your comment, it's related to your comment. When my daughter came back 2 years ago, she was in the first grade, and she came back on the first day of school. And then I want to tell you something that really, because of her statement, I started to explore disciplinary procedures. Well, she came back from school with a sticker here, with a smiley. And then she said to me, "Mommy, look, I got a smiley today in school." And I said, "Why did you receive a smiley?" And she said, "Because I behaved well." And then she thought and she told me, "I don't understand why they give us these stickers because we behave well. I behave well because I want to respect others." And I think that this is a really beautiful statement, right, about the role of school in teaching children, like also, of course, about her statement about participation, but also about how do we teach children to behave well. Do we give them stickers? Do we shape a curriculum that teach them to behave well? Or do we create much broader policies that teach children the values, the deeper values, like how to behave well or to participate? And I think that if we use participatory disciplinary procedures, not only for discipline, but also for it calls like a whole school policy. So in the end of the way, we will prevent many conflicts and produce much better decisions. And I invite all of you to read about restorative practices. This is a really great approach. There are similar approaches also, in terms of how to make children participate in school policies. But I love this approach because it's all about participation. Like we do circles, and in each and every disciplinary issues, the teachers don't decide alone, but also the victim and the child who was violent or something else, they all sit together and find the solutions together. There's a lot of research about it in the world, and also several studies in the US, I think. Yeah, in the US also. Yeah.
Yes, I think from your description of your daughter's response, you give you a smiley sticker for being a good mother. But I think your point is interesting because you've taken it down to you've taken it into interesting places about how we actually do construct curricula for fostering exactly the kind of interpersonal conflict resolution skills, participatory skills at a very early age, preferably in kindergarten. And as you say, there are a number of programs in a number of countries, I think probably even here, which are deliberately treating this as the very early foundations of civic and moral education at the very early stages, long before they get to the point even of worrying about circuses and animals. So, yeah. Jay, do you want to make any final comment to make or not?
No, I mean, I just think that my only point is the distinction that I was harping on earlier, right, which is that I think that participation provides a sort of richer framework for thinking about these problems, but I don't think that it doesn't solve the key issue that I think is at stake, which is that it's about children, and that, as Matt brought up, it's also about in schools, which are not necessarily, we've not necessarily conceived of them entirely as purely democratic institutions. And because they're children, there are concerns about the degree of autonomy that they should have as they get older. So I think that it gives you some resources for thinking about those things, but it doesn't solve those problems in any way. So I think that's my final and only point.
There are no instant solutions in education for anything. Yeah.
Well, we will be putting information about Lotem's papers on the CMEI site. We might even be able to put the paper you circulated to us on the site. We'll talk about that later. So there is more information about Lotem's extremely exciting and very important work. And thank you again for talking to us. And we hope you continue to enjoy your time here. And you meet lots more interesting people as well. So thank you, Lotem. And thank you.